All right, so welcome, everybody. I'm Paul Schacht, professor of English and director of the Center for Digital Learning at SUNY Geneseo, where I also direct a project called Digital Thorough. And this is the first of 3 sessions we'll be holding on editing and encoding in the undergraduate classroom over the next 3 weeks. The series grew out of a SUNY Innovative Instruction Technology grant that I received in the 2019-20 academic year, which was supposed to fund a 2-day workshop on the SUNY Geneseo campus last spring. The pandemic ended that plan, but I'm really excited that we're able to put on this series to take its place. And one thing that's great about this as an alternative plan is that it opened the door to collaborating with the New York Digital Humanities group, which I'm really happy to see is well represented here this evening. The NYDH needed a theme and a virtual venue for its 3rd fall meeting this year. So this series is a joint enterprise of Geneseo and NYDH. And since Serenity Sutherland at SUNY Oswego is here with us and a huge reason for the success of NYDH, thank you so much, Serenity. I'm going to hand things over to her for a moment for her own quick word of welcome.
So hopefully what you're seeing is just a brief, dare I say, promotional slide telling you a little bit about New York Digital Humanities. Basically, our main goal is just to connect people who are close by, geographically able to travel within a day's trip for in-person gathering. Obviously, that has not happened and maybe won't be happening for a while. So I'm really thrilled that we can have this virtual event because it's opened up our geographical scope that we originally started with. And we have people here from all over. So I'm really glad that in a way that we're able to do this online and that Paul approached me and asked if we'd like to do this. So I'd really like, if you haven't had a chance to connect with us, I'd love to continue the conversation on Slack. That's our Slack channel there. If it sounds confusing, let me know in the chat and I can just send you an invitation to your email, or just feel free to follow us on Twitter and keep up with what we're doing. Ideally, we'll be having an event every year. So in addition to the fall series, we've talked before about a spring series, so you never know what we might come up with, but we do plan to continue with our fall events every single year. And we also have a mailing list, so please let me know if you'd like to be included on the mailing list. Before I turn it back over to Paul, I really do just want to say a quick note of thanks to Paul for inviting this group to be part of what he's accomplished here with this event. So thank you to Paul. And also I want to say thank you to Nick Wasmoen and Fiona Cole, who have been really instrumental in helping NYDH get up and running. So thank you to you guys for all your hard work. And I think with that, I will turn it back over to Paul. If anyone has any questions about NYDH, please feel free to get in touch.
Yeah, or put them in the chat, as Serenity mentioned before. Thank you, Serenity. I also want to give a quick shout out to the other organizers of the event, my collaborators on the IIT grant, some of whom overlap with folks that Serenity mentioned a moment ago. Aliza Bashir-Bandar at Penn State Barron, Fiona Call at SUNY Oswego and the University of Toronto, Rebecca Nesbitt at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, Nick Wasmoen, already mentioned, at the University at Buffalo, Beth Witherell, editor-in-chief of the writings of Henry D. Thoreau, published by Princeton University Press, Caroline Woydot, my colleague at SUNY Geneseo, and Amanda Wentworth, my partner in crime in the Center for Digital Learning at SUNY Geneseo, where she's the Digital Humanities and Learning Coordinator. All these folks will be participating in next week's session, October 15th, same time, 7 p.m. You'll get a separate registration link for that. And our group will share some of the work that we've done on the grant around teaching and coding with the manuscript of Thoreau's Walden next week. So let me now briefly introduce our speaker for tonight's session, Professor David Birnbaum. is professor and co-chair of the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches courses on Russian language, Russian fairy tales, and computational methods in the humanities. He studies Slavic historical linguistics and medieval Slavic manuscripts and texts, and he's been involved in the study of electronic text technology since the mid-1980s. He serves on the board of the Association for Computers and the Humanities, the editorial board of Markup Languages, Theory and Practice, and the Text Encoding Initiative Council. Much of his electronic text work intersects with his research in medieval Slavic manuscript studies, but he also often writes about issues in the philosophy of markup. I first met David when I took the course on XPath that he and Eliza teach at the yearly Digital Humanities Summer Institute at the University of Victoria. And I have to say, their course was one of the clearest, most engaging, and most useful of the many, actually, that I've taken at DHSI, and far and away the best documented, with teaching materials that I keep going back to and learning from. So I am enormously grateful to David for agreeing to kick off our series with his talk on theorizing and implementing digital editions. A million thanks, David. And I will turn it over to you just as soon as I remind everyone, please keep your microphones on mute during David's talk. When he's done, we could try to, I think we have a small enough group that we could try to just have some informal conversation, but also feel free to put questions for David in the chat as he is speaking or afterwards, and we'll get to those questions too. So with that, let me turn it over to you, David, with, again, a million thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. Before you mute yourself, could you reconfirm that you can see my slides and they're moving?
I see your slides and they are moving.
Okay, we're off. Thank you, Paul, and thank you all. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak this evening about one of my favorite topics, that is about theorizing and implementing digital editions. The function of a keynote address, as I understand it, is to play the key for the orchestra or band so that they will all chime in the same musical key. So the key I've selected here is going to be some ways to think about digital editions. I'll say very little about the Walden Fluid Text Edition, because you all know more about it than I do, but it will play a role later in my talk. So let's go. I'm going to talk first about digital editions from a fairly high level. Well, that is to say, how do I understand what a digital edition is? Particularly, what do I mean by digital and what do I mean by edition? And then I want to ask us to reflect on why we make digital editions, because we don't just do it because it's there. We make an edition typically for a reason, and I'd like to suggest some ways we can think about those reasons. One of the things that distinguishes a digital edition from a traditional paper edition is, of course, the digital technology. And that raises some additional issues that I will turn to next. I'll talk about the relationship between the data underlying your edition and the presentation, that is to say, the interface through which you expose it. I'll talk about standards and publication frameworks, that is to say, why these are good things and why they pose challenges. And I want to focus at that point on the toolkit, because often humanists who are beginning to build digital editions devote too much attention to the technology because that's new. And for that reason, it's both exciting and a little intimidating. But in fact, the toolkit is not the place I would start building an edition. So I want to talk about where I think it fits into the workflow. I have prepared a gallery of exemplary digital editions. These are editions initially not by me. I then have a few of my own at the end, not because they're exemplary, because you ought to know what I do. But what I mean by exemplary is that they illustrate features of digital editions that are consistent with and relevant for the topics I'll be introducing in the first part of this presentation. And then I'll try to pull it together in the end. We have an hour and a half. You'll be happy to hear I will not talk for an hour and a half, probably about 40, 45 minutes, because I wanted to leave a lot of time for discussions. So when we ask ourselves what a digital edition is, we have to think about those two parts of it. And I'm going to start with the edition issues, because to the extent that we were trained as humanists, we have probably had some experience with editions. In my own case, I have no formal training in technology or in computing. Pretty much everybody my age who does what I do is largely self-taught. So the digital part came second. So I came into this business knowing something about editions because I had worked with them as a humanist, and then having to learn what it meant to move them into a digital sphere. When we make an edition, we have to decide what goes into it. And on this slide, I'm talking not about anything specifically digital. Everything on the slide is about editions of all sorts, both digital and the more traditional ones on paper. Any edition we make involves choices. We decide what to include, and either explicitly or tacitly, we decide what not to include. And the way I think about this is that the editions that I prepare represent my theory of the text. It's what I think there is within the text that I would like to communicate to the users of my edition. I also have to think about why I'm building the edition. And in most cases, that's because it meets an immediate research need of my own. I create editions so that I could study the texts myself. I am a historical linguist and philologist by training. I also have to think about the rationale for building a specific edition. For example, if you make the first edition of a text, you are making it accessible in ways that it wasn't before. If you make a new edition of a text that has already been published, the expectations are different because you're not making it available for the first time. You have to have something new to add. I put the term digital archaeology in this bullet point because what I mean by that is sometimes we have occasion to remediate an existing digital edition that was built with ancient technology, like technology that's 10 years old, and pulling the data out of that and moving it into a more powerful, not just more modern, but more capable framework often requires some digging. And one of our goals as we think about building an edition is to try to extend its lifespan by not requiring subsequent users to have to work too hard to get at what we've built into it. As we construct editions on paper or digitally, we can think of types of them. The perhaps best known type of edition of text is a text critical edition. That is to say, one that examines variant witnesses to a text and tries to make sense of how the text was transmitted. Sometimes the goal is to reconstruct an archetype or some other earlier form. Sometimes it's to study the pattern of transmission, the relationships among the witnesses. So it's not always focused on reconstruction, but that is a common goal. Editions of manuscripts are different from editions of texts, and it's one of the challenges because the texts are abstract. They are instantiated in manuscripts, but the manuscript is the only thing we can see and touch. So we infer a text from the information that we can access in the manuscript. Common types of manuscript editions include photographic facsimiles, diplomatic transcriptions, which is a term commonly used to mean transcriptions that try to reproduce the orthographic details and peculiarities of the original. You may have encountered the term hyperdiplomatic edition. There is no definition of that where I hear it used. It's used by people disparagingly to say to somebody else, you put in too many fussy details. It's fine to do a diplomatic edition, but you overdid it. And while we might be tempted to think the more detail, the better, not only is there a cost in time, but there's also a hidden cost in accuracy because the more we're trying to retain during our transcriptions, the more opportunity there is for error. And in my experience, at least, the more errors we make. Then in between the idea of editions of text and editions of manuscripts are things like genetic editions, which are how the text came to be through the layered evidence in the manuscript. And then a pedagogical edition is something different because it intersects with the other types. It's an edition that's made more for teaching than for research purposes, and the goals there may be different. An edition often does not fall neatly into one of these categories. They intersect, they play together nicely, and we have to think about the type of edition we're making, why we're making it, and these are some of the parameters we can keep in mind. Within any edition, there could be limitations and compromises on the sources that are available. We may be preparing a critical edition where we do not have access to all the manuscript witnesses. Or perhaps we have access, but we do not have permission to publish. And we have to decide what compromises we are willing to make. In some instances, the edition that we would like to prepare, for the edition we would like to prepare, we would like to use the best sources, but the best sources are under copyright protection and we cannot get permission to redistribute them. So there are some digital editions that are made with what a scholar would regard as inferior sources, because that's what you can use. And the fact that it's inferior to the best current edition doesn't mean that it isn't necessarily of great value for what you want to do with it. And finally, you need to document both your sources, this is called document metadata, and also your processes, how you went about preparing the edition. This becomes even more important in a digital edition, because whether you prepared your print edition using classical text editor or Microsoft Word isn't going to matter a lot to your end users. But because with digital editions, people often want to reuse the data, how it was prepared, that is to say the process metadata matters. And then finally, there are considerations of end user access. How we're going to publish our work, we want it to be useful to other people. How are we going to arrange for its distribution, for access, for its preservation? With books, that's fairly straightforward. You try to find a reliable publisher who will make sure that your book reaches the audience you would like to reach, who will keep it in print, who will make it affordable so that the audience you want to reach can actually buy it and use it. Books can last a very long time. They have a certain stability. On the other hand, once books go out of press, the existing copies are still lingering in libraries, but whether people can access them, what you do if you want a book that's out of press becomes challenging. Let's move into digital considerations. When we make a digital edition, I try to distinguish between a digital edition and a thing you read on the computer. And one of the distinctions I make is whether the digital edition takes advantage of digital possibilities. I've sometimes run into the term silicon paper to refer to the kind of so-called digital edition that you read on the screen, but you might as well be reading it on paper. It has no interactivity. It has no particular means of, no enhanced means of access. Typically, you can do a textual search, although sometimes not even that. But beyond that, it really doesn't take much advantage of what a computer is capable of doing. On the other hand, at the other extreme, and we'll look at some of those, people build reader-centered interactive interfaces where the user can customize what gets displayed and how the user interacts with it to meet the user's research needs. There's also the question of static versus dynamic editions. With a reader-centered interactive interface, you might think that it would naturally gravitate toward dynamic, but one of the consequences of using a dynamic edition is that it often depends on software, and software is fragile. We'll talk about that a bit more later. And when some software platform goes out of vogue and it's difficult to find servers that can host it, do you want your edition to die? So there has been an increased interest recently in generating static sites, which is to say, taking all the possible things you could get out of a dynamic edition, storing them, and the interface goes into those. So you no longer need the active processing. Everything has already been processed. Static sites tend to be large because you pre-generate everything. They're not always possible, but they give you a sustainability that's difficult to get with a fully dynamic edition. One feature that distinguishes a digital edition from a paper one is that the data and the presentation, although we engage with them together, are separable. So the data can be distributed independently of the interface, and that gives great potential for reuse and for aggregation, but it also raises questions about where the information resides. There are some developers of editions who think all of the information, all of the intelligence is in the data. It's all in your markup and your transcription. There are others, and I belong really to the second camp, that thinks that the interface is also an intellectual product, and I'll try to illustrate why later, and that really the information is distributed. One way to think of this might be that with a very large amount of data, it can be hard to find the thing you're looking for. So the interface is one way that the developer can shape the information and make sure that the end user can find what the end user wants to find. Digital editions pose sustainability issues that are different from those from paper editions. As I said, books last a long time. Once it's on the shelves, unless something happens, it's probably going to sit on the shelves. But because software is so fragile, digital editions can become unusable quickly. And therefore, there is rightly an interest in sustainability and the preservation of a digital edition. That is obvious benefits. You don't want your work to disappear because the software platform has gone out of vogue. On the other hand, there's a cost. You may have to make compromises in what you do and how you do it in order to provide for a more stable, more sustainable platform. I try to think of sustainability as occupying a space somewhere between rationalizing sustainability. You want to make sure that the thing you produce has a reasonable lifespan, and fetishizing sustainability. 500 years from now, 100 years from now, is somebody going to have made a better edition of your texts? Is yours going to have the same value that it had before? And to be sure, anything in the history of the text has an archival value, but the value today of the new edition with new material and new interfaces may be less than the value when somebody comes along and maybe has access to additional materials and to new methods. And there's a reason that people make new editions. And one of those reasons is that the existing ones no longer meet the needs of the community. There's also a question with digital editions of community participation. We know how to cite a paper edition. That's the bibliographic standards for citation are well established. Citing a digital edition is harder. One team that's tried to work with this is the Perseus project, which has developed something they call canonical text services, which is basically a referencing system that lets you reference a digital edition in any version at any level of granularity. It may not be the only way to do it. It may not even be the best way to do it, but it's a recognition that citing a digital edition poses problems that you different from the ones you encounter with a paper edition. There's the question of reuse. When you prepare a digital edition, somebody may have other uses for your materials that you didn't envision. With a paper edition, they get what you published. With a digital edition, you can make information available in a way that's easier for other people to work with. And finally, there's the question of open annotation, which is a form of crowdsourcing, where you may want to allow users of your edition to contribute to enriching it. Finally, with digital editions, there's the question many humanists ask, do I have to learn to code? And the answer is yes, but not much. You have to understand what's possible digitally, or you're going to miss opportunities. You don't have to write all of your own code, but the idea that a digital edition can be built with a humanist who has all the ideas and a programmer who knows how to translate them into a digital reality often runs into trouble because the humanist doesn't know what's possible computationally, and the programmer doesn't understand, despite the best of intentions, doesn't understand what some of the goals could be if only the humanist understood. So somebody on the project needs to know enough about both the research and the technology to be sure that you're not missing those kinds of opportunities. But none of us has to build our projects entirely by ourselves, and typically we don't. We have different areas of expertise, and it would be foolish for us to invest our time where others can do better. One point that I've always considered crucial is that we make digital editions for a reason. We don't just make them because they're there. We don't make an edition of a text because no one's done it before. There are lots of texts nobody has published before. We make an edition of a text because we think there needs to be an edition of this text. Sometimes the reasons involve preservation and access, particularly if there's never been an edition before. Sometimes the edition is going to be incorporated into a corpus, and it's going to be used maybe not for close reading, but for what's called distant reading, where researchers aggregate information from a large volume of material. But typically we make digital editions because we have research needs, and those needs may be textual, historical, critical. They may be linguistic, they may be historical, they may be some combination or something different. And when people ask me how to go about making a digital edition, the first question I always ask is, why do you want to make this edition? Because that's going to govern what will be the best way to do it. What counts as best practice in constructing digital editions is not static. Best practice today may be different tomorrow, but even today, best practice for you may not be best practice for me. So the idea that there is a formula that we can all learn, there's one way to make a digital edition, the idea that you can go to digital edition training school and then come back and make one is valuable up to a point, but I would encourage you not to start with a formula, rather to start with your research goals. Think about why you want to make an edition, what you want to be able to get out of it, and only then to begin to think about how to do it. I've always considered research questions fundamental to the editions I make. And part of the reason for that is that the data that goes into the edition is necessarily selective. It happens in transcription because the handwriting is analog. And when we type it up, we have to make decisions about when two-letter forms should be treated as the same and when they should be treated as different. And crucially, sometimes they should be the same for some purposes, but they should be different for others, and we have to decide how to represent that. The amount of metadata and the amount of markup we use to enrich our texts could be unlimited, and we have to limit it. We have to, and how we make those decisions, how we decide what metadata to represent, what markup to use, is often dictated by what we want to do with our document. We may think that we can just follow a formula or a set of guidelines or a checklist, but not thinking about these choices at a fairly low level is nonetheless making choices, except it's making them without taking responsibility for them. So we want to understand why we're doing the things we're doing and why we've decided not to do other things. Some types of editions are useful for some kinds of inquiry at the expense of others. So in a diplomatic edition of a manuscript with very fine transcription of the orthographic details, how much detail is enough? Where do you stop? When do you become hyper diplomatic, which is to say too diplomatic? In a text critical edition, where you traditionally have a critical apparatus that lists significant variants, how do you decide what's significant? What's significant for your purposes may not be significant for somebody else's. This is editorial judgment. And as an editor, you're supposed to exercise your judgment. But to the extent that you are making data available, if you exclude variants from your edition, then how is anybody going to gain access to them? So you have to balance your need to exercise your editorial judgment with the awareness that the decisions you make sometimes are irreversible. Finally, we build editions because we build them for our purposes. In my case, I build them because I have research needs, but I also don't want to make them inaccessible to others. So I want to find a way to balance making sure I can do what I need, but also making it possible for others to make good use of my materials, to build on them, to ask different research questions without having to duplicate the work I did that is also of value to them. One issue of thinking about digital editions is thinking about how to balance the roles of data and presentation. There can be no doubt that data is first. If you have bad data, you have a bad edition. It has been said that data ages like wine, and software, which is to say the framework within which you present your edition, software ages like fish. In other words, software is inevitably going to be obsolete, and probably pretty soon, where your data, on the other hand, will grow more valuable as other people engage with it and enrich it. So you do not want to make any compromises in the quality of your data. This has led some people to think that the data is the only thing that matters, and the interface just gets in the way of the data. This is not true if you make your data available outside of your interface. You do not have to decide to treat the interface seriously or treat your data seriously. You always treat your data seriously, but the interface I think of as a research product, and I'll try to show you some editions where interface decisions have facilitated types of research that would be challenging or maybe not even possible without those interfaces. Your interface is not neutral. It is not just a way to present the data. Interfaces inevitably make some kinds of access easy and some kinds of access difficult or impossible because the developer didn't think they were important or maybe just didn't think of them. So you do not want to lock your data inside an interface, but you also want to recognize that the interface is part of the value of your product. And I at least want to take it seriously. You want to build your edition with an appropriate attention to standards. And by standards, I include not just official standards like those published by recognized standards bodies, but also community standards. What are people in your community of practice doing? A big advantage to observing standards is you are probably not the first person to have your problem. And if a bunch of smart people have looked at it, made decisions, made mistakes, and then fixed them, you don't want to have to redo that. You're not going to do it as well. Furthermore, if you observe standards, other people will know how to interact with your materials. So you enhance the opportunity for interchange and interoperability. Those are not the same thing, but basically what they mean is that what they both mean is they make your materials more useful for somebody else. If, on the other hand, you're operating outside of standards, everybody has to learn what you did. So why would you be wary of standards? They don't always meet your needs, or they don't always meet your needs in a natural way. And in those cases, you have to decide how important are those needs. We call them needs for a reason. Do you want to constrain your edition to meet what the standards already support? Or do you want to enhance the standards with the understanding that doing so is imposing barriers, not insurmountable barriers, but imposing barriers to the use of your data by others? One community standard, they refer to it as a guideline, is the text encoding initiative. And that's probably familiar to many of you. The text encoding initiative is a very old business, and their goal was to make available guidelines for how to encode texts for computational processing in the humanities. It has sometimes been explained that the TEI does not try to tell you how to do it. They tell you, figure out what you want to do, and then we have some guidelines for how you can do it so that it will be easier for other people to use it too. That is not always observed in practice, but I think it's an important distinction. One challenge of using guidelines is that the guidelines often will not meet your needs exactly. Yet if you try to cook up your own solution, then you're going to duplicate other people's effort, and you're going to introduce a lack of coherence and consistency within your community. So this is a delicate balance, and you want to find the right spot between them. Often TEI markup will meet your needs, but only as a cost. If any of you follow the TEIL mailing list, most of the questions are about, how do I do this in TEI? The researcher knows what the researcher wants to do, but figuring out the way to do it, or a way to do it in TEI, is an additional challenge. And often the answers are, you could do it this way or you could do it that way. At which point you, the encoder, have to say, okay, which one should I use? And the answer is you have to decide, and you want to decide for a principled reason. So if you wish to observe TEI markup, it may not always give you the most direct way to represent the structures in your document. For example, you may have to represent large hierarchical levels as div elements, and you can name your div elements, you can give them types. It's not like you can't distinguish the types, but it may feel more natural to you to actually call the parts of your plays acts and scenes. Well, you could have different schemas for different life stages of a document. I'm not the first one to observe this, but you might decide that for development, you want a bespoke schema that says exactly what you want to say as economically as possible. But at a later stage, you want to transform that programmatically. Of course, you're not going to retype. You want to transform that into TEI markup, because at that later stage, it becomes more valuable to you than it was at the earlier stage. The TEI is intended to be customized. The people who have been active in a TEI for a long time are sometimes surprised at how little customization goes on. There is a version of the TEI called TEI All, which supports all of the almost 600 elements in the TEI, and lots of people build their editions or other projects by just using TEI All and remembering we use these elements, but we don't use those elements. That's really not getting your money's worth out of XML. What we ought to be doing is customizing our version of the TEI, and TEI provides a mechanism for doing this, the ODD, which says in my project, I can't use these elements, or even though the TEI says they're okay, or I can only use them here, even though the TEI says I can also use them there. Expanding the TEI is fairly easy. It isn't that hard to add new elements using an ODD. It does complicate interoperability because then what are other people going to do with your elements? And you have to figure out how you're going to deal with that. Constraining the TEI does not affect interoperability. You're just not using stuff. People would know what to deal with it, but they're not going to need it in your project. On the other hand, it's costly. When I've written very detailed ODDs to try to constrain my markup, and then I go into an XML aware markup editor and I start an element, I am shocked at how many elements are allowed there that I intended to exclude. And there's a reason deep in the TEI architecture why it's difficult to fine tune which elements can appear where. The upshot is that, especially if you're working in a team, your team will tag more consistently if you nail down exactly what's allowed where, but doing that in a reliable way is challenging. Michael Spurberg McQueen, who's a former editor of the TEI, once commented that schemas exist on a continuum from enabling to enforcing. So an enabling schema lets you do what you want. TEI All is as enabling as a TEI schema can be. An enforcing schema makes sure you don't do anything that you don't want to do. And your project is going to be tighter, better, more consistent, more accurate if you're enforcing, but enforcing is a lot more work. Once you have your texts marked up, then you have to think about how you're going to make them available to others. And often people look to publishing frameworks to do that. And there are good reasons to do this and also reasons to be cautious about it. Publishing frameworks, some publishing frameworks, including some I'll illustrate today, are very robust. They have a lot of capability, including a lot of capability that's of broad interest and importance in the digital editions world. Why should you rebuild something somebody else has already built and tested and debugged and developed? You can reuse the existing framework. The better frameworks give you control over customization, so your edition doesn't have to look exactly like somebody else's. But it's basically, it saves you a lot of technical development work if somebody else has already built the infrastructure for the edition that you envision. On the other hand, what if someone else's infrastructure hasn't envisioned everything you want to do? And this becomes insidious because you may not, if you start by looking at the publishing framework, if you start by looking at, say, a library of TEI publisher editions, that may constrain your imagination about what you can do in your edition. And this goes back to why I suggested earlier that we start with the research question and we start with the goals of the edition. And once you know what you want to do, that's the time to look for a framework that will let you do it. Starting from the framework can lead to missed opportunities. One of the other problems, or let's say challenges with a framework, is that it risks lock-in. In some cases, frameworks will require that they'll accept TEI input, for example, but they'll expect certain types of TEI input, where TEI gives you a choice about different ways of doing things. A publishing framework may expect certain information to be in certain places. If you then want to move to a different publishing framework that has different expectations, you have to change your document. And that really shouldn't happen. Your TEI should represent what you want to say, and then your publishing framework should be able to deal with it. And this is, there isn't much one can do about this except be aware that the more you depend on the restrictions and limitations of somebody else's framework, the harder it's going to be to move to a different framework that may have different restrictions and different limitations. Some of the better known digital edition frameworks in use are TEI Publisher and the edition visualization technology, EVT. I'll show some slides of those shortly. Some of the lighter ones, and I put these in the last point and all together, are things like TEI Tapas, Boilerplate, XTF, and these last ones really aren't intended for full-featured digital editions. They're mostly for getting a quick look at your document, for interacting with it. Often, especially when you're working with students, and learning how to prepare editions is one of the focal areas of the set of workshops. Often when you're working with students, Paul and I were discussing this just before the session started, they type all their angle brackets and then they look at their angle brackets and say, now what? And TEI Tapas or Boilerplate or XTF, with less preparation than the more robust frameworks, let them see, oh yes, there's an addition in there. They can see how the markup pays off. So let's look at some of these. This is from TEI Publisher promotional information. They published an edition of Shakespeare's works. So, and the details of what they show and what they don't show are really less important than the way they've thought about what they want to do. So they've imagined that you want to see a fairly diplomatic layout. Notice the italics, the indentation, the lineation, which is all based on the print. On the other hand, they've also produced a photographic facsimile, and they have an inset in the photographic facsimile that lets you see where you are on the page. So this gives you several views on your information simultaneously. EVT has come out in 2 editions, and these are their, so these are 2 different ways that they expose data. On the left, you have something that is different from, but similar to, the TEI Publisher view we just looked at. So you see a facsimile of the manuscript next to a transcription, but notice that you have matching highlighting. So often when I'm working with a digital edition, I'll read the transcription because it's easier. But if I have questions, I want to go back and look at the original. This makes it a lot easier to find your place in the original. On the other side, you have a comparative view of different versions. You have highlighting of points of variation. So this is an interface that's designed, if the one on the left is designed to let you study a manuscript closely, the one on the right is designed to allow you to study textual variation closely. When we make a digital edition, we have to think about the tools we're going to use. Part of that is the publishing framework, but sometimes the publishing framework doesn't do everything you need. And you may build your own, or you may supplement it with some of your own work. And the way I think of the toolkit is that I start with the goals, including the research questions. And one issue that sometimes doesn't get enough attention in planning is the idea of non-goals. And the point of a non-goal is that it's very easy to fall victim to what has been called scope creep, where the scope of your project changes as you work on it, and you become aware of more and more things that, oh yeah, we might as well do this as well. And if your project is constrained by time or personnel or funding, scope creep can be the enemy of getting anything done. So while you're defining what you want to accomplish, be explicit. And one way to be explicit about what you want to do is to think explicitly about what you might do, but that you're not setting as a goal or a primary goal at this point. As you define your goals, you need to do that in the context of your working environment. Do you have a deadline you have to meet? Does your publisher have expectations? What sort of human effort, how many hours of effort and with what degrees of skill can you throw at this project? But once you've identified your goals and once you're aware of your resources, then I think it's the time to look at how you're going to do it. And at that point, if you can find, if somebody's already built something that meets your needs, it would be foolish not to use it. On the other hand, if it doesn't meet your needs, I would be cautious about adjusting my ambitions to meet what the toolkit can do. It isn't that hard to build stuff yourself. And by yourself, I don't just mean you yourself, I mean within your team. A lot of programming digital humanists are self-trained, and you can do a lot with less knowledge and expertise than you may think. I want to caution again against the misunderstanding of how collaboration can work in digital edition projects. It is not uncommon, and it is beneficial for a digital edition collaboration to have people who are subject area experts and people who are technology experts. But one of the things that distinguishes collaboration from compartmentalization is how well those two people can talk to each other. So I will not repeat what I said earlier, except to say that the subject area expert should take an interest in what the edition facilitates and what it doesn't. And the developer should take an interest in what the researchers might want to do with the data. And the more you have people who have basic expertise in both of those domains, the less likely it is that you're going to miss opportunities. I want to move at this point to some exemplary editions, and some of these you will recognize. I have just one or two slides about each. I'm going to go through them kind of quickly because the point isn't to dissect them in detail, which is something I sometimes do with my students. Rather, it's to dazzle us all with the enormous variety of digital editions and to encourage us to think about how we build editions to meet our needs. The Van Gogh Letters is one of the best known TEI publisher editions. And what we can see here is that it has parallel columns with metadata on the left, an original text with a lot of annotation and notes in it, a translation with annotation and notes, and I've moused over one of those so you can see the pop-up. It has more explanatory notes in the right side. It has the ability to change what's in which columns and to add and remove them. So it's intended to give the user a great amount of control over what to see within the limits of the screen, of course. You cannot add an infinite number of columns. When I work with paper editions, sometimes I'll have multiple books open on my rather large desktop. Your screen is never as large as you wish it was. So as the designer of a digital edition, you want to think about how to make the best possible use of your digital real estate. And one way you can do that is to give the user control over what to show and what to hide. This is a close-up of something we saw earlier, the Vercelli book project in the EVT framework. So it's got the same kind of highlighting. I have dropped down one of the drop-downs on the right to show that there are actually two transcriptions that are available, diplomatic or interpretive, and those, of course, come out of the same XML. So the edition software is controlling which one is displayed. The Welcher-Gast project, I chose mostly because of what's in the right margin. So in the middle, you see there's a diplomatic transcription of an original medieval source. The lineation is preserved. There are a lot of little buttons on the bottom that control the user's access with it. But the stuff on the right, I think, is what's most important because of what it exposes to the reader, not just to the developer. So you can control whether you display verse and line numbers, how you deal with abbreviations. Are they kept? Are they expanded but annotated, or are they expanded silently to make a more readable edition? Whether you normalize variant letter forms. I'm not going to read through all of these lines, but I was very impressed by the variety of things that these developers thought of, and it makes me go back and think about whether I've missed some opportunities in some of my own editions for what we might want to control. The Scholastic Commentary Text Archive is designed to study well scholastic commentaries, and often the organization is not by manuscript, but by commentary, by the texture commenting, by the commentator and the like. So this edition is pulling information, fragments of information, both textual and graphic from different sources, and combining it on demand to create a reading view according to what the user has requested. The Thomas Gray archive is designed for studying the poetic structures of Gray's work. So you have, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you have a list of poetic lines, each of which has a plus sign on the end. But I've clicked one of those plus signs for line number 2, and you can see how a lot of information is available that might be of interest to students or scholars of poetry. It is not obtrusive, but it's accessible on demand. You can also see that there's some generalized data about poetic features of the text in the upper right margin. We would consider these metadata. And the information that's provided here then is consistent with the poetic goals of the project. It would not be appropriate to focus on this in some other editions. And conversely, things that were important for other editions are less important in this one. St. Patrick's Confessio has, in many respects, it is similar to a traditional critical edition. So your reading text, your copy text is on the right side, and on the left side you have the various apparatus that often accompany a scholarly edition. So you have the critical apparatus at the top, the apparatus of sources below that, of biblical sources below that, of commentaries below that, and then underneath you have the manuscript apparatus. And scholarly editions include different apparatus depending on what their goals are. The critical apparatus is most common if you have variant witnesses, but these other types are also fairly common. What's cool about this edition is you can show and hide them on demand. So if there are things you don't care about, get them off your screen and you can read more easily. But if you suddenly need them for a reason, you can summon them up. The Shebang project is an edition of the Hebrew Bible, and one of the things that I think is cool about this is its word level access. So I have clicked on Vayihi Erev, and it was evening, and that's highlighted in kind of a bluish purple in the text. And the list of words in the right has opened to include listings for the and for evening. And this is giving you then a more linguistic and low-level linguistic access to the text than in the editions we looked at earlier, which were more interested in the text on in a communicative rather than fine-grained linguistic level. The Faust edition has made variant and annotated information available, some in the margin and some, like the Thomas Gray archive, on demand. So here I've moused over and expanded something, and you can see how some of the lines are color coded based on the amount of variation. You can expand the ones you care to expand. You can see hints in the margin, and then you can see more detail in the middle. The Shelley Godwin archive, which holds Mary Shelley's manuscripts for Frankenstein, is perhaps one of the better known archives of a genetic edition, which aims to study not just the text diplomatically, but also how it came to be. So you'll notice there are radio buttons at the top where you can show or hide the hands of Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley, because both of them had hands in this manuscript. On the right side, I've chosen to show a diplomatic transcription, but you can instead decide to show the TEI markup or anything you want anything you want that has been anticipated. So this is an edition that has focused on how the manuscripts came to be and has tried to prioritize providing access to that information. And then, of course, the one you've all been waiting for is, which I'm not going to talk about because you know it more than I do, is an edition that is designed to make accessible all of the evidence for Walden and to allow the user to explore and compare it according to varying research goals. Now, it would not be fair of me not to share a little of my own work. So I'm going to show you some screenshots from some editions I have built. And again, what I want to focus on here, and I know this better than I do with the editions by other people, of course, is why I made the decisions I did. So for the Repertorium of Old Bulgarian Literature and Letters, which is basically a metadata project, I skipped through the long wordy slide because I'm running a little behind and I don't want to eat up too much time. I want to leave time for discussion. But what I've done here is I have searched for manuscripts that contain the text of the Physiologus that are in our inventory. It shows me them. I can click on the manuscript and see a codicological description, a list of the texts or the raw XML. I can also search on other manuscripts in the same repository, the same city, the same country. Or I can select some of these witnesses and show the view that's on the right. This is called a plectogram. And the idea behind it is the main purpose of the Repertorium was to find which manuscripts have texts in common in the same order, because this tells us information about the copying process. So what I wanted to come up with was a way you could see at a glance which manuscripts share information and how that information is organized. So each column on the right represents one of those manuscripts I checked. The connecting lines show that two manuscripts share the same text. Because I couldn't fit the entire title of the work in the little yellow cells, because I wanted to be able to fit more manuscripts on the screen, I replaced them with reference numbers. The user is not expected to know those. You can see what the work is by mousing over it. That's that blue pop-up. I can draw connecting lines only between adjacent columns, but what happens if, and I can control the order of the columns. Those little plus signs at the top are drag and drop. But even so, I may not be able to arrange the columns so that all shared information is connected by a line. So I also added color coding on mouse over. So the magenta cells are the moused over ones. And even if they're not connected by a connecting line, you can nonetheless see at a glance if you're mousing over the left column and there's a text that also appears in the right, that will light up and it will tell you something. So what I was trying to do here was maximize the opportunity for users to explore which manuscripts have the same texts and when they do and don't have them in the same order. The Rus Primary Chronicle is a chronicle, an analytic historical writing that was finalized, although it continued to be developed beyond that, was finalized in Kiev in the early 12th century. There are 5 or 6, I say 5 or 6 because one is incomplete, principal witnesses. And what I wanted to do here was provide a text critical edition, but I wanted to overcome the limitations of the critical apparatus. I didn't want the user to have to depend on my decision about what counted as substantive and non-substantive. So I wanted full transcriptions of all of the witnesses. I also wanted to exercise my editorial judgment, and I say my, but this was a team effort. So exercise our editorial judgment about which readings to prefer. I wanted to make it possible to compare our editions with the work of other editors. So those light blue lines on the bottom are other published editions. The black lines are manuscript evidence. The red line is our reconstruction. And the way you interact with this is you read the reconstruction continuously on the top. It's the full text, it's scrollable. But if you want to see the manuscript evidence that led us to say, this is what this line most likely said in the original, you click on the reference number and that scrolls into view down below. And at that point, you can see the evidence supporting our decisions. So the idea here was to do the normal work of a text critical edition, but try to overcome some of the limitations in traditional documentation. It would be, we publish this on paper, by the way. I was about to say it would be difficult and expensive to do this on paper. It would be. The paper edition is 2,800 pages. It occupies 11 inches on my shelf. And the only way we could do it was that there was a subvention that made it possible for Harvard University Press to publish the whole business for less than $100. So real users could afford to buy this and use it. But obviously, once you start duplicating information the way you do when you have full transcriptions of every witness, where they are largely similar, a digital edition is convenient because storage is much cheaper than the economics of paper publication and print and distribution. If that was a text critical edition, this is a diplomatic edition of a manuscript. So we have on the left a lineated transcription of the manuscript. And we have interlinear Greek because this manuscript is a translation from the Greek. On the right, we have the facsimile. We have a little magnifying glass to blow it up. We wrote that magnifying glass ourselves. It is one screen of code. It is as lightweight as such things can be. And there are lots of powerful, capable, valuable frameworks for serving images nowadays through a protocol called IIIF. And there are at least two viewers, Mirador and OpenSeaDragon, that are open source, open access. And a lot of people build those into their editions. Shelley Godwin Archive used one, but it was much heavier than what I needed. And by building it this way, by using just plain old images and my own magnifying glass, it's less capable, but it has all the capabilities I need, and I can navigate through it a lot more quickly. And then finally, Daniel the Prisoner was designed, this is a pedagogical site, so it was designed to help students of medieval literary culture explore how a florilegium, a collection of let's say, meaningful sayings might have circulated. This happens to be a Russian one. It circulates in two major versions. These are not different witnesses to the same work. They are two works, but with a lot of shared textual information. So we have one of them, continuous reading view on the left, the other on the right. And then we have a diagrammatic representation of the top of where they agree and disagree, both in their content and in their arrangement. We can see here that section 25 on the left has been the information, and has been split up over three sections on the right. There were biblical citations in these readings. A medieval reader would have recognized them immediately. A modern reader wouldn't. So we've added down below, there are short biblical and apocryphal references. And when the user clicks on them, the full text pops up. So again, it's a student edition, and the modern reader now has access to information that would have been available to the medieval reader anyway. This is my last slide with content on it, and then I'd like us to move to discussion. What I've tried to argue is that whenever we build an edition, whether we intend to do so or not, our edition expresses a theory of the text by making some features of the text accessible and other features less accessible, or sometimes inaccessible. And whether we think about what our edition is going to do or not, we're still making those decisions. So we might as well make them thoughtfully and intentionally. In my own work, I start with a theory of the text. That is to say, what I think my text has to communicate, and my research goals, what I want to get out of it. I never start with the tools, because I have no programming training. I say this not just because I can build the tools I need. You guys can find someone on your team who can do it too. But if you start with a toolkit, then that's going to constrain your choices. Once you know what you want to do, then you can think about how to make an edition that meets your needs. Use the existing tools if you can, because somebody put work in them and they're probably pretty good. Recognize that the interface matters. It's not just an arbitrary way to publish your data. Think about what you're making accessible and how, and what you're not making accessible, or what you're or how you might make information accessible in different ways. I didn't show you the slide of this, but we looked at one edition where there's a view of the text as a force-directed network graph. It pulls out information in the text, for example, references to persons or places, and shows which ones co-occur with which other ones in the same space. That's that is an edition of the text. That is a view of the same XML as the reading view. We don't think of it as an edition because it's a very selective picture, but the reading edition we make is a selective picture too. And there's no reason why your edition shouldn't produce whatever pictures you think are important. If you think back to the diagram at the top of my Florilegium edition, or the plectogram to compare the contents of my manuscripts, those come out of the same XML as a reading view. And then finally, we want to make our data useful. The main criticism I hear about interfaces, and it is entirely fair, is that you don't want to lock up your data behind your interface. You don't want to make the interface an obstacle to other people working with your data in ways you haven't anticipated. Make it freely available, make it available outside the interface, but that doesn't mean that the interface doesn't matter. And then finally, observe community practice like TEI markup when you can, because there's a real payoff to doing it. On the other hand, don't let it constrain your options too. The most important thing is to make the edition you want to make. And that's it for me. I'm going to stop slide sharing at this point, but as Paul said, we'll make the slides available later. I would welcome questions and discussion.
Well, while people are thinking of questions, which they can go ahead and unmute and ask, or put in the chat, or comments or reflections they want to share. Let me just thank you again, David. That was wonderful, comprehensive, provocative, tons in there to learn from and think about. I know we all appreciate it greatly.
Yeah, I want to say thanks, but also I'm really curious. So you're a linguist, and it seems like you spend a lot of time dealing with literary editors, maybe also historical editors. Do you want to talk about that? What's it like to be a linguist by training and then to be training literary editors all the time?
Sure. Before I answer this, let me ask you, for those of you who don't mind, could you please stop hiding your video? It feels more like a conversation at a real conference. If we could see one another, if you're wearing your pajamas, that's fine. But if you could show yourself, I'd be happy to see you all. My personal journey was that I had occasion in the mid-'80s to work with a manuscript because I was interested in information that it provided about an important and understudied question in Slavic historical linguistics. And as I was reading this manuscript, I became puzzled by the text because there were parts in it that seemed odd to me. And at that point, I took a detour, because you could do that in those days. They didn't force you out of graduate school in 5 years. So I took a detour and I learned something about textual criticism. And it gave me a better understanding of the text I was working with, which gave me a better understanding of the language of the text I was working with. So as somebody who was already working with medieval manuscripts as a historical linguist, learning to work with them as a textual historian wasn't a big leap. One of the things that helped was that I already knew how to read them, and that's a sticking point for a lot of people. When I look at Thoreau's handwriting, I would need to work to read that. But once you've already made the investment in learning how to read something, this was a way to get more mileage out of it. I should say also, when I began all of this, I had used a computer. This was before the World Wide Web. There was email, but that was kind of it. And I knew no programming languages, and I had never thought about digital editions before. But in the course of thinking about what I wanted to do with my documents and with my materials, I began to see ways in which a computer could do things better than I could, where there are things a computer can't do, and then there are types of mistakes that only a human can make. So I took another detour and learned a programming language. which, by the way, isn't that hard. You guys have all learned other languages because you're researchers, and programming languages are tiny. So the payoff for having learned how to get the computer to do what it could do well, for me, was enormous. So it's my journey, I guess, was from linguist to textologist to digital textologist.
Thanks.
So after all those detours, how long did it actually take you to finish graduate school? I'm just curious because that's a lot of detours, and that sounds fascinating.
I don't think I want to tell you. You if you really wanted to know, there are places you could look it up. But I will say, when I started doing all the work I do with digital methods, there were no workshops like this. There was no DHSI. There was a text encoding initiative, but it was barely doing anything. Digital publishing, to the extent that it happened, was on CDs that were expensive and had locked for copyright reasons. So people who are getting into this business now have a lot of advantages that weren't available to people of my generation. So at least the technology part would not have taken me as long today as it took me then.
That kind of makes me wonder then, what kinds of inspiration did you look towards, or how did you find this and piece it together? And the reason I'm asking is because when I was watching those displays of the different ways the texts are connected through the lines, it almost reminded me of Vannevar Bush's description of the Memex, where he would try to trace through his documents all these lines. I'm just wondering if some older styles of media connections or theorizing about media helped influence the way you thought about your documents, especially because you're part of the group that was formulating all of this. Maybe for someone like me who's coming up now, I can see models and decide which ones I like. But how did you come up with that, I guess?
The plectogram visualization, the connections among the the works and the manuscripts, it came about because I became involved in the mid-90s with a project at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences that was looking at this research question, but they didn't have a workable method to do it. They, believe it or not, they would take an enormous piece of paper, like the size of the floor in the room, and they would list all the manuscripts on the top and all of the constituent texts on the side, and then they would try to write in the cells which one occurred where. There are lots of reasons why that doesn't scale, and why it's hard to use. And they recognized that there were probably better ways to manage this data computationally, but they didn't know how. And neither did I at the time, but I was one of the first people in Slavic manuscript studies to start working with digital materials. So they found me, and we had long conversations about the research goals. And I read their publications, I understood the research questions and the information they needed to extract from the manuscripts in order to do it. And at the same time, there was a Slavist at Harvard University named Hugh Olmsted, who had pioneered plectogram visualizations for a different purpose. But I knew his work, and I recognized that this was something that could be adapted to the needs of this miscellaneous manuscript working group. So in some ways, it was no different from any other inspiration. We walk around all day knowing things and learning things, and at some point we recognize that these two pieces of information would be valuable if we could put them together.
David, you said a couple of times that an edition expresses a theory of the text, and I'm wondering how that differs, if it does, how a theory of the text differs if it does from a model of the text. It's common to talk about the work that we're doing when we're encoding as data modeling, and the product being a model of the text. And I think I easily see how you could build multiple different models of a text in order to see the text in different ways, because you have different goals, as you pointed out. Is that the same concept as a theory of the text, or are those subtly or very different things?
I've also sometimes referred to modeling, and I'm not strict about what I think of as a theory of the text and what I think of as a model of the text. But now that you ask, there may be a useful way to distinguish those if we can think of the theory as more abstract, and then the model as a way of instantiating the theory. Now, mind you, people use the term model in an abstract sense too. So it's whatever usage we come up with is going to be conventional. But I try to think about what I'd like my edition to be able to communicate. And one might think of that as theorizing. When I think about how I want to organize it in order to facilitate that communication, I might think of that as modeling. I am improvising here because your question is making me think of something I haven't thought about deeply before. But I think the distinction is useful, and I may just have been conflating them a little too casually.
Thanks. That's helpful. The idea of a theory seems to me to be more that you're either developing the right theory or the wrong theory. The theory, you know, the one that explains the phenomenon, or one that misses. Whereas the term model more immediately suggests to me the notion that you could build any number of them, and they would all be representing the text in different ways, but all potentially of equal value.
The theory you conceive, I think, is going to be tied to what you want to do with your text. For example, I don't do linguistic markup in some of my textual editions because I'm not building them for linguistic study. With that said, so the theory of the edition that I want to build doesn't include that. On the other hand, after the Supersliensis, the Ultra-Slavonic manuscript I showed you, for example, did not have linguistic annotation, but I shared it with a corpus linguist colleague who applied machine learning methods to add linguistic annotation to what for me had been a textual transcription for really for the purpose of manuscript studies. And we might say that we brought different theories, different methods, and different expectations to what we were doing. Happily, they were not incompatible, because although I used a bespoke schema for this, I did that because it was much simpler than anything else. So she was able to interact with it in a pretty painless way and give it back to me. And I haven't done it yet, but I can introduce the linguistic annotation into the edition. So, for example, it doesn't do this now, but you could mouse over a word and all the linguistic annotation would pop up. Really, it's just been too much focus on other things that kept me from doing that, because I did it in a proof of concept. It's a good way for people who have different research goals to collaborate on building something that is of use to all of them without compromise. There's been an increased interest in the linguistic corpus community in better integration with digital editions. There was a product out of Humboldt University in Berlin called Laudatio, which was about designing repositories for corpora that would be sensitive first to the needs of linguists, but also to the needs of textual scholars, so that preparing text for one purpose would not disenfranchise the others. And that's kind of important, because once somebody has done a transcription of a 300-page manuscript, it's going to be hard for somebody else to go do it again. But if you can reuse it, then you get a lot more value without doubling the effort.
I'm a little curious about following up on that. So I think, one of the things that you have as a text editor is really a sense of responsibility. If you edit something, it's probably not going to be edited again. I'm curious. I don't know. I know you work with a lot of different projects. Either as like a mentor or advisor. What are the kinds of things that like you're really worried about people getting wrong or mucking up and like creating stopgaps for future scholarship?
Because I was one of the first Slavists to work with digital texts, and the medieval Slavic community is a small one. People who were just getting started in those early days would often ask me for advice, and they would start with things like, I want to make an edition of something, and I would ask them why, and if they couldn't answer the question, I would encourage them to think about the answer before they touch the keyboard. So one of the, I don't know the extent to which this was true in the days of paper editions. I've used a lot of paper editions. The first big digital edition I made was the primary chronicle, and we did that initially on paper, but I then converted it for digital publication. So our expectations there were different, but that was intended for a particular purpose, and that guided our decision about what to include and what not to include. So one issue I see is not knowing why you're making the edition, because as we saw from these examples, there were so many choices, and you might as well make them knowingly. The other common pitfall is choosing the software first, seeing an edition and thinking you're just going to pour your text into that, and it's going to look just like somebody else's. And maybe that's the right thing to do, in which case do it. Someone else did the work. But if you're not starting from your research goals, if you're starting from an implementation on a platform that someone else has done, you're going to think of your own materials in the framework of that other work. And the research should drive the choice of technology rather than letting the technology constrain the research. So I guess those are two things that I try to think about in my own work, and I try to encourage other people to think about.
David, I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on collaboration versus compartmentalization, which is something that afflicts, I think, as humanities scholars, for many of us here, we run into this issue of needing to consult technical support and needing to make our decisions based on guidance we get from people who seem to know technology better than we do. And sometimes we would make what we discover sometimes is we would make different decisions had we investigated the technology ourselves. And I wonder if you might want to comment on that a little bit more.
In In general, I would ask a digital humanist for guidance before I would ask an arbitrary programmer. People tend to recommend the things they know. And for an example, overwhelmingly, the most common type of database technology in use anywhere is the relational database. Relational databases are 70 years old. It's a mature, robust technology, lots of open source implementations, and they're great at what they do. What they don't do is represent text especially well, because that's not what they were designed for. But I have run into projects where the humanist doesn't know or care about the technology, and the caring is really the issue. And they ask a programmer to build something, and the programmer builds what the programmer knows how to build. So to the extent that somebody has experience both with humanities research, textual research questions on the one hand, and with the technologies that can support them on the other, they're more likely to arrive at a better solution. I could give you an example. I'm building an electronic dictionary at the moment, and there are two other projects that are doing the same thing. And we're working independently, although we're in touch and we share information and materials. And we're all using completely different technologies. And one of them is being built by someone who is he has a PhD in Slavic historical linguistics, but he's a professional programmer, and he's writing it in C++ because that's the language he feels most comfortable with. I'm writing it in XSLT and XQuery because I think those are well suited to this kind of data. And this other developer is an old friend of mine. We've known each other since grad days, and I was rather gratified when he said, this is the way to do it, because I was more used to thinking in the context of these kinds of materials, and that wasn't the sort of development that he was used to doing. And there isn't much that most programming languages can't do. It's not that you can do something only in one and not in another, but programming languages are better at some things and worse at others. And somebody who's used to working with, if someone is used to working with textual data, is going to be better served by consulting with people who are used to coding for textual data. The times when I turn to hardcore programmers or computer scientists, which is not the same thing, is when I run into computational issues that are beyond my expertise, because I'm not trained in computer science, and I have some understanding of what makes programs run quickly versus slowly, but I don't know nearly as much about that as somebody who has that kind of training would. So when I see myself getting into trouble, I go talk to somebody who knows. But it's helpful for that conversation that I know where I'm in trouble, and I can ask the question that's going to get me out of it.
So as a technologist, on the flip side, I think you should always look for a collaborator who's relatively humble in their computing.
Good luck.
But it's also, well, it's a challenge, right? And to the collaboration versus compartmentalization. Sometimes when I work with people, I'm like, wow, that is one way to do it, but there's such a more elegant way or a different way. And the real issue is to come from it as a holistic methodology, which is hard to find. But also I found that this is our area where we should be developing people, because there are so many technologies that are out there that the computer scientists and mathematicians have these brilliant things, but you know what? They don't know how to apply it to humanistic endeavors. And it's almost easier for me to understand oh, this in Walden is interesting. So it's a little easier to train programmers to humanists. And going backwards, we have to downshift the programmer sometimes and say, whoa, 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 whoa. We're not going to learn C++ for this. Is there a better tool? Is there a better way? And I think that's a dynamic that I would love to foster with some of the computer science people. I'm at RIT now, and they're all digit heads. And their little digital humanities is this itty bitty building on this huge campus of geeks. And they're geeks too, but in a different language. And I think the challenge that we need to sort of address is, how do we get to the same language? As you're saying, David, you know, you come at it from different angles, and as long as there's the respect to say, okay, that's a good way, well, that might be a better way. It's an interesting position. I've been working with Paul for a while, and I have learned new things. I now can appreciate that humanistic thing where normally it's, you know, oil and water. Ooh, this math. No, I don't like math. But in reality, some of the advanced graph theory stuff is exactly what you're looking for some of the tech stuff. The problem is that they want to teach you calculus first. It's like, no, 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 no. I need to know this, which is a graduate level course. Let's skip over all that. So just a flip side of the equation.
Well, which we can do now, because we can, there are courses online we can take. So when I needed, I've never studied calculus and linear algebra, I could go look up what I needed to know. And at some point I would run into trouble and I would need the advice of a mathematician, but not as soon as I might think. An example of the kind of difference in perspective that you mentioned that I've run into involves the computational approaches to linguistics, because computational linguistics at my university, at least, is practiced in the linguistics department and in the computer science department. And boy, is it different. The computer scientists are very interested in the mathematics of natural language processing. And if you can bump your accuracy or your efficiency by a few points, that's a conference paper. They're not interested in human language necessarily. And where, on the other hand, the natural language processing in a linguistics department cares about whether it tells you something useful about the language, and you know, a few percentage points in your execution time, that's not your object of study. And but both of those perspectives have merit, and there's a strong integration in the source material, but often a big chasm in the research questions.
Well, we're well past 8:30 at this point, and I want to be respectful of people's time, especially yours, David. So let me thank you once again for a really inspiring evening. This has been a great discussion. I look forward to more of them. I want to remind everybody that our next session is October 15th at 7 p.m. The group of us who have been working on a fresh encoding of the Walden manuscript and some modules for using Walden to teach undergraduates about digital scholarly editions. We'll be presenting some of our work, and then the final one is on October 22nd, where some of you who have said that you would like to share work that you're doing we'll do lightning rounds, and we can have some more discussion. So thank you, everybody. Again, I will be in touch once the recording is processed about where you can find it, and hope to see you on the 15th.
Thank you all very much. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next 2 weeks when I'll sit quietly and learn something. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.